Hello, today we're going to be talking about soil characteristics, and this is super important because it's really the basis for everything else we talk about in this unit on land use. So the importance of soils might be fairly obvious to you. The whole ecosystem really depends on them. Remember that soils really provide a lot of the nutrients that plants need, and then the rest of the food chain is relying on those plants. In addition, they provide a lot of water filtration services for us. They give us our landforms around us, and they really help provide the basis for the entire environment itself. So without these soils, we really couldn't have the ecosystems that we've been looking at. When we start to look at the composition of soils, we've seen this graph already. We see that they're about 45% minerals, 5% organic matter, and then the other half is water and air. And it turns out that all of these portions are very important, and they're all things you need to know about. So one that we want to talk about first is called pore space. And there's some vocabulary words that go along with this. So porosity, aeration, and permeability are all going to be important here. So when we're talking about pore space, we're talking about the spaces in between the particles. And this pore space usually should occupy about 50% of the soil's volume. It gets filled with various parts of water and air, and that's where that other 50% of the soil comes from. So both water and air are really necessary to have a moist, aerated soil that's going to sustain plants and other sorts of life. So when we're talking about this, we talk about it in terms of porosity, which is basically how many gaps the soil has in between the particles. So the higher the porosity, the more soil and water is going to be able to get in there. Then we also talk about aeration. So aeration tells us how much the air can get into that pore space, how easily it is for that to happen. So the easier it is, the more aerated it is, and that means the more air is going to get down to those organisms underground. Then we talk about permeability. That's the ability of water to infiltrate down into that pore space and start to percolate and leach downwards. And that's really important because water dissolves so many of those important minerals and things like that, and it brings those nutrients down with it as it percolates through the soil. So pore space is very important to soil health because it's providing an area for all of these chemical reactions to take place, such as respiration for organisms to get energy from their food, nitrogen fixation, and even a lot of the weathering processes that actually make the soil in the first place. Then in addition to that, it's allowing that water to transport things down to lower levels in the soil. And that process is called alluviation, when it takes the nutrients and it from up in the upper layers and it deposits them down lower. So we're going to see today that there's a lot of ways where soil is kind of like the Goldilocks principle, where it wants to have just enough and not too much of a lot of things. So water is one of those things. It helps to have enough pore space in your soil that water can get through, but you generally don't want your soil to be completely saturated with water either, because then not enough air can get through in that case. So you want to have a good balance of water and air in your pore space. Now that soil air is very important because of course the oxygen is providing the fuel for cellular respiration. So over time you're going to see that carbon dioxide levels go up in the soil and oxygen levels go down as cellular respiration is converting those molecules. It has all of the same gases down in between the particles of the soil that you would have in the air. So just like in the air, you want these gases to cycle around. You want to keep exchanging them with the atmosphere. And if you're able to do that pretty easily, if it's well aerated, that's going to support a higher level of biodiversity because all of those organisms can get the oxygen they need to do respiration. But there's a lot of things that could change your ability to keep your soil aerated. So that porosity in the first place, the amount of the pore spaces, but also things like temperature, the depth of the soil, the amount of water, and if you have a covering on the soil or not. Different types of coverings will let in more or less air. So a lot of those impervious surfaces that we talked about being a problem with water pollution, this is also a problem here because if air can't get into the soil underneath things like things like roads or houses, that means that that soil underneath those structures is probably not as healthy either, since it can't support the life forms. So it's also important to notice that porosity and how permeable a soil is determined by two major factors, particle size and compaction. So you can think about it when you have a lot of large particles. So think about a bunch of tennis balls in a container. You're going to have a ton of space in between them because they're so big that they leave these big gaps. If you have really small particles, so think more of, I don't know, something like nerds or M&Ms, where they're tiny little things, they're going to compact downwards more, and they are going to leave less space in between those tiny little particles. So the size of particles is really important. But even if you have particles of the same size, how much they're compacted down, how much they're pressed down, can change the porosity of the soil. So if they get compacted too much, that can prevent water and air from getting into that soil, and then that can cause less life to be supported in those areas as well. So this is something that we have to keep in mind when we do things like build roads or houses, is that in most cases we are compacting down that soil, and that can affect the ecosystem in that part alone, even if you don't consider anything else. All right, so we need to talk about how soils form. And soils form in two major ways. The first way is that the parent material, which is also called the bedrock, and it is literally rock, is broken up into pieces over time by weathering. And this usually happens from the bottom upwards. So you can kind of see in this case, as time goes on, you get more and more weathered material. And then as living things die and decay, they're also adding to the soil. They're adding that organic matter. So that process usually happens from the top downwards as these living things are adding to that organic humus. And this takes a very long time, so this is another reason why we want to really conserve our soil resources, because we just don't have the time for it to regenerate. But if we keep them healthy in the first place, then we can keep this. So I just want to remind you that weathering process that we're talking about happening from the bottom up in many cases could either be chemical weathering, where you have a chemical reaction that is changing the minerals around in the rock, or it could be physical or mechanical weathering, which is when the rock is physically being broken into smaller fragments. And remember, that could also involve some biological weathering, like trees getting in there and breaking the rocks open with their roots, or it could also include things like ice heaving as well. So all the rates that this weathering is going to occur at, and therefore the rate that the soil formation is going to occur at, can be affected by many different things. First of all, the amount of surface area that the soil is exposed at, or the rock is exposed. The more the surface of the rock is exposed, the more weathering you're going to have. Then the composition of the different minerals in the rock. Some minerals are stronger than others, so they have tighter bonds, and then it's going to be harder to break them off into little pieces, so they're going to resist weathering. Some are very easy to erode, so that's going to change things significantly. And also the climate. Cold and dry climates tend to favor physical weathering, and that's because you get a lot of that ice action where you have water going down into cracks and freezing and breaking things apart. Warm and wet climates tend to favor chemical weathering because water is a key part of a lot of these chemical reactions. So a lot of these things like frost action might actually work better where you have huge temperature fluctuations, where things are going to get very warm and very cold. All right, so all of these different conditions can affect how quickly soils form. And then don't forget that once sediments weather, they can erode as well. So remember, weathering is just breaking down the rock. Erosion is actually moving it from one place to another. So that would be caused by gravity, wind, or water. And then once it gets to wherever it's been moved, it gets deposited somewhere, often at the mouth of a river in a delta area or something like that. And that's deposition at that point. So we wind up with two different types of soils in the end, transported soils and residual soils. And transported soils actually were made somewhere else. The rock weathered in another area, whereas residual soils, the weathering all occurred in that one place and it has not eroded. So when you have erosion taking place, you wind up with some different soil types that don't necessarily look like the bedrock down below them. Whereas in a residual soil, you're upper levels of your soil should still kind of look like the same sorts of colors and things that you see in your rock and in your any kind of sediments that are lower down. The mineral composition of the soil and of the rock is also very important. These minerals in the soil that make up about 45% basically provide a place for plants to anchor, and they also provide a lot of essential minerals. Many of the minerals themselves are things that plants need for their own body processes, just like we need to incorporate minerals into our diet. Plants need things like potassium to be able to go through all of their normal processes. So we see that in certain rock types you wind up getting certain minerals. So for instance, a rock rich in aluminum is going to give you different soil characteristics. That will give you an acidic soil. If you have rocks that are rich in iron or magnesium silicates, those soils often wind up deficient in these other ions, calcium, nitrogen, and phosphorus, because of the way the chemicals interact with each other. In general, the older the soil is, the more weathered it is. So the more broken down into little pieces, you have much less of your original bedrock. It also tends to be less fertile because as that rock is weathered, a lot of it is reacting with different chemicals in the soil, or a lot of those minerals are now able to be taken up by plants, and eventually that nutrient concentration might be depleted in the soil. Geologically young soils, which remember are forming because of the process of primary succession, tend to be very nutrient rich because a lot of those soils have those plants in those stages that are coming in and colonizing the area and then dying off. As they die, they're leaving behind their organic material, and that puts plenty of nutrients into the soil. Now, it's not only a question of which minerals are weathered and broken down, but also what size they get weathered into. So as we mentioned, particle size is very important to the porosity of the soil. So there are 3 basic particle sizes that are still considered soil, and then once you get beyond this, you get into pebbles and gravel, and at that point it's considered rock. And these are the basic sizes of those particles. So sand, you can see, is quite small. But it's actually the largest of these particle sizes. So once you get down below gravel, your largest particle in soil is sand, and that's a particle of about this much in diameter. And then silt is smaller still, and this is to scale, so you can see how much smaller. It's very significant. So here's your range for diameter of a silt particle. And then clay would be invisible at this scale. It's so much smaller. So that is our finest particle. And clay, because it's such a fine particle, it's so powdery that it has a huge surface area compared to the rest of them, and compared to its volume, it's almost all surface area. And that really determines a lot of soil characteristics, and that's going to be important later when we talk about types of soil. Alright, so that is your mineral component of your soil. That's the 45%. Now let's talk about that 5% of organic material. So remember we mentioned that the second step in forming soils is when the organic material gets added to the top of the soil from the top down. And that's happening because things like bacteria and fungi are able to grow in any kind of sediment that's being left behind by weathering. And that creates that primary succession where you get lichens and things like that first, and then you get larger and larger plants. And as these things come in, they start to leave behind leaf litter as they drop their leaves, even if they haven't died. That's going to add organic matter to the soil. Their dead remains, as they die and decompose, they're also going to bring in things like fungi and microorganisms that are all going to start to add to that soil, and many of these organisms are decomposers that are purposely cycling a lot of these nutrients. So it's really important to remember all of those nutrient cycles from earlier in the year, because this is really an integral part of this. The soil health and the food web really can't be disconnected from each other because they're both so essential to cycling those nutrients around the ecosystem. So all of those organisms that live in the soil provide lots and lots of ecosystem services. So they do things like maintain the soil fertility, and that's by cycling all those nutrients around. They also prevent soil erosion. So we've talked about how plants and trees, their roots can kind of hold soil in place and prevent it from eroding. They break down toxins. A lot of them are more resistant, especially plants can be resistant to toxins and take them out of the groundwater. So they're helping to purify and filter that water. And then, of course, they support their own food web and food chain on their own. So there's entire ecosystems down below the ground that you're probably not thinking of on a daily basis. Earthworms are particularly important. You probably know that they ingest different organic matter in the soil, and that helps cycle the nutrients. You may or may not know about their castings, which they look like this, and they're basically digested soil that gets deposited up on the surface. And this is really important because it helps bring a lot of those nutrients from down deep in the soil up to the top where a lot of the vegetation is. In addition, their tunneling aerates the soil. It increases the porosity, it allows water to flow easier through the soil, and their waste and their organic material will also help enrich the soil as well. There's also another important symbiotic relationship here that we mentioned earlier in the year called mycorrhizae. And basically these mycorrhizae are a fungi and a plant living together, and there's a couple different ways that they can do that. But in general, they help by fixing nitrogen for the plant, and also they allow the plant to absorb a lot more nutrients, and the fungi kind of get a place to live in the meantime. So this mutualistic relationship can increase the surface area of the areas where a plant can absorb nutrients and water significantly, and a lot of these plants cannot survive without the fungi that help them to get all of their nutrients. So all of these different life processes are super important in not only forming the soil, but keeping the soil healthy for long periods of time. And we've talked a lot about that organic material in the soil. Well, there's a couple different types of organic material. You have a litter layer on the soil, and this is basically your decomposing leaves, your leaf litter, branches, organic material, any kind of detritus, some dead stuff that's lying there. That's right on the surface. It hasn't completely broken down yet. That would be considered litter. And then right under that, you get this really dark layer, and if you pull it up, it looks kind of like this, and that is the decayed and decomposed animal and plant remains. So at this point, they're starting to return to some of their more natural elements. They're not as arranged into living things as they once were, and they're starting to be recycled back into the environment. So you can find this humus layer right underneath the vegetation. And this decomposition process of breaking down these organisms is what puts the necessary minerals and nutrients back into the soil. In addition, this humus acts like a sponge and it absorbs moisture, so it helps the soil to stay wet enough to support plants. So just to recap here for a second, remember we have bedrock that's weathering from the bottom up, so we're getting more and more rock as time goes on. Or more and more small particles of rock and more layers of soil. And then we also have the organic matter that's being added to the top as primary succession goes along, and then that's going to add more and more nutrients to this. So you'll notice some things are labeled here. So when we dig down into the soil, we can get a huge chunk where we see a bunch of different layers, and that's called a soil profile. And then each one of those layers is called a soil horizon. And depending on the type of soil, you might have a different number of soil horizons. So in some soils, you might only have a few. In others, you may have many more. And you need to know what each of these horizons stands for, these letters mean basically, and what to look for in a soil. So the O horizon would be the very top layer, and this is mostly organic matter. So this is only going to exist in soils where you have a lot of plant material on top that's going to be dying and decaying there. The A horizon is underneath that. That's the topsoil, and you have a very high concentration of organic matter there as well. Most of the humus and the leaf litter is in that O horizon, but some of it's going to sort of combine with that A horizon as well. The B horizon is also called the subsoil, and here's where you have clay and different cations that are leached from the A horizon. So all of the water that percolates through is bringing these chemicals down with it, and they get deposited here in the B horizon. And then the sea horizon is under that, and that's basically your weathered parent material, your bedrock. So after your bedrock has been broken down into smaller pieces, that becomes more of the sea horizon. And then the last one, which is called the R horizon, even though it's not listed here, it's R for rock. That's your bedrock itself, technically not really part of the soil, and I think that's why they didn't label it here. But you can see in this particular diagram they do have it. So these always basically follow the same pattern. One thing you might want to put down, sometimes we have this level called the E horizon in between the A and the B, and this is called the alluviation layer, and this is basically where a lot of those nutrients are leaching to. So sometimes you'll get this very nutrient rich, but in some cases also very toxin rich or very clay rich layer called the E horizon. There's also another vocab word that goes along with this, and it's mostly talking about this sea horizon here, where you have those weathered pieces of rock. You have something called regolith, which is basically a layer of weathered rock fragments. It doesn't have a lot of organic material in it, so that would again usually be in that sea horizon because that's where the bedrock is first breaking down. And you can see that in this picture here. Here's your bedrock, and you can see your sea horizon with your regolith, and then you can see your topsoil on top. So as I said, not every soil is going to have every layer. If you have a residual soil that was actually made in that location, you're going to be more likely to have all of the layers. If you have and distinct layers in that case, if they've been laid down as the rock is weathered and as the organic material decomposes. If you have a transported soil, that means it was made somewhere else and it's been transported there and deposited. So in a lot of cases, transported soils won't have any horizons. You won't be able to pick out the layers because they were brought all together, all mixed up, and then deposited in that one area. So that can make it a little bit more difficult. Now, we already talked about particle sizes with sand, silt, and clay, but it turns out that these particle sizes also can determine a lot of the characteristics of the soil. So we're going to be using something called a soil triangle in our labs in the coming week, and I'm going to show you how you can figure out, based on the percentage of each of these you have, what type of soil you have overall. Some things that we tend to notice is whenever we have a clay soil, which has a high percentage of clay, and it'll be up here in our triangle, that is coming from rocks with a lot of feldspar, and the problem with clay soils is they hold lots of water and they don't want to drain. Those particles are so small that they're going to hold on to everything. So they're also easily compacted. They tend to have really low porosity, so it's very difficult for plants to grow in high clay soils. The other problem with clay soils is that they generally have a negative charge on their surface, and that means that they're going to attract positive ions and repel negative ones. So this can be good because when they bind positive ions, they hold on to things like potassium and magnesium that plants need. But in addition, that also means any negatively charged ions are going to be repelled by them and wash out of this zone and leach down into that E or B horizon where they can't be used. Sandy soils, on the other hand, are just the opposite. They don't hold water. They drain very quickly, too quickly, and then the plant can't get enough water. In addition, it's going to leach a lot of those nutrients away with the water as they percolate down through the layer. If we look at soils that are predominantly silt, these have very fine particles, not quite as fine as clay, but these have sort of a silky feel, like a cornstarch. They're not so waterlogged that they will not let the water through, but they tend to erode very easily because they're small, they travel easily, and you can usually find these in riverbank type areas. So when we talk about soil types, a lot of times we're talking about the amount of water that it's able to hold and the amount of water that it will release. So there are some important things we want to look at when we look at different types of soils. First of all, how many nutrients can it hold? What's its water infiltration capacity? Can the water get through easily? What's its water holding capacity? Is it going to go through too quick, or is it going to hold on to some of it? Its aeration level, so how much the air can be exchanged, and then its workability, which is basically how easy is it to plow and use as agricultural land. So you can see a couple different types of soil in both of these and kind of how they do. And I want you to notice that in both charts, we have kind of this happy medium going on, and that is called loam. So loam is our ideal agricultural soil. It's kind of like that Goldilocks soil. It's just right. It lets just enough water in, but it doesn't hold on to water so much that everything drowns. It lets just enough air in. It's nice and permeable. The smaller particles bind those minerals that we need and bind enough water for the plants, but they don't suffocate anything. So this mix is a 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay mix, and this is what most farmers and gardeners are after because it's the healthiest for your plants. Now, besides the soil type or texture that you have, it's also important to consider the soil pH. Most soils, a healthy range is in between a pH 4 and a pH 8, so they tend to be a little bit more on the acidic side in general. These are some of our most extreme soils. The pygmy forest is the most acidic at a 2.8 to a 3.9, and Death Valley soils are the most basic at a 10.5 pH. So some things that tend to make soil more acidic are conifer needles, decomposition of organic matter, acid rain, and respiration, which is releasing CO2 and turns into carbonic acid. All of those things will lower the pH and acidify the soil. Things like soil salinization and some products of industrial waste processes could make the soil more alkaline. Although that's not as common, it can happen. Either way, going too much in either direction can be bad for the plants that are living there. So acidic soils can absorb things like aluminum and manganese in toxic amounts. Those plants will take those in until they are no longer healthy. Basic soils, on the other hand, a lot of these nutrients that we need, that the plants need to take up, are not really available to them because they're not going to bond in a basic soil. So your overall soil type depends on a lot of those things. It depends on what rock you have in the first place. It depends on the acidity of the soil. It depends on your horizons and things like variations in climate and vegetation and the topography of the land and the age of the soil. And when we start to look at different soil types, we start to see some patterns where certain places have certain horizons in their soil with certain characteristics. And there's 12 different major types of soil overall, and then those get subdivided even further from that. But the 5 major ones that you need to know are these ones, so we'll go through them one by one. So the spodosols are the ones that are normally found in those taiga areas or those coniferous forests, and they tend to have acidic soils because of the pine needle litter. That would mostly be contained in the O horizon. They don't tend to have a lot of nutrients in their A horizon, so in some cases they may not even have an A horizon at all. And because of all of those acidic leaf litter up at the top, that will leach down into the E horizon, where you get a very acidic layer there. Then they have a dark brown alluvial B horizon that has organic matter from those broken down leaves, where things can still survive because it's not as acidic down there, and it also has a lot of aluminum and iron oxides that have been carried down by that acidified water. Then you have an alpha sol. This would be the type of soil you find around here in a temperate deciduous forest. So this would be a humid climate. You have a hot summer, a cold winter. So you have a lot of leaf litter in your O horizon. You tend to have a very rich layer of topsoil in the A horizon, a lighter colored E horizon, and then a clay-rich brown B horizon, which holds the water in that layer. Mollisol soils are more common in temperate grasslands, so these would be semi-dry climates, but hot summers, cold winters, and still enough water to support a grassland. Remember, grasslands are great for agriculture. That's because they have this thick, dark A horizon. They have a huge layer of humus that's able to support that plant life. And they also have a thick B horizon that's rich in minerals like calcium carbonate that the plants need. Then deserts, on the other hand, would have aridosols. So this would be a very hot, dry climate. And in this case, you can see there's pretty much no organic material. So you have very little, maybe a very thin A horizon, pretty much no O horizon, and then this light brown B horizon with these different minerals that are accumulating here because in many cases this soil has been salinated. And then our last type that you need to know about is oxasols, which are the types of soil in tropical rainforests. So this is a very wet and very hot climate. There's little or no accumulation in the O horizon. So there is a small O horizon, but there's so much decomposition going on here that those nutrients are being taken up so quickly by the plants as soon as they decay, they don't really have time to build up. You tend to have an acidic A horizon. It does have a lot of humus, but again, it's not always nutrient rich. And then your thick B horizon underneath that is very highly leached, and that means that the water is taking all those minerals out. It does not have a lot of nutrients by the time you get down into that layer. So if we look around the world, we can see that all of these different types of soils very much determine the types of ecosystems that we find in these areas. So over the next week or so, we're going to be looking at all these different factors that feed into soil composition and see why they're so important to many of our environmental processes. Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow.